My name is Ayesha Bell Hardaway, and I am an associate professor of law at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your brand new article, The Rise of Police Unions on the Back of the Black Freedom Movement, that was printed in the Connecticut Law Review. And I'd love for you to kind of walk us through how you got to this topic and what you found in writing this paper.
Yeah. So, so I've been researching and writing about policing since about 2015. I started in the research, and just by way of background, my earlier research focused on large-scale structural reform litigation that was initiated or is initiated to address longstanding problems in policing, brutality, misconduct, and the like. And so that structural reform litigation that gives birth to this bed of case law came about through the passage of Congress's 1995 crime omnibus bill after the horrific beating, right, of Rodney King by the LAPD, and then the subsequent acquittal by the state of California of those officers. And in congressional hearings, right, Congress hears about all of these problems, not just in LA, but around the country. And so then a statute is passed, previously known, the statute was 14141, which was really easy to remember. They recently recodified it, and it's like 12601 now. But it authorizes the U.S. government through the Attorney General for the Department of Justice to sue police agencies for conduct that they deem to be patterns or practices of unconstitutional policing. And so my initial research looked at the ways in which police unions who were moving to intervene in some of those cases, right, used their collective bargaining rights as the basis to get inside of the litigation, right? Those collective bargaining rights were supposed to allow them to negotiate the hours, the wages, right, and general conditions of their employment, but they were using them to make arguments about whether or not the reform efforts were appropriate job conditions for them. And so it was in that first article that I was struck by what I would say is a relatively rapid ascent of police unions and the timing of their rise, which occurs during the 1960s. And so I spent some time researching and writing about other issues in policing between that first article and this most recent one. But I always had more to say about unions. And I knew that, and I still have more to say about unions, but that's how this particular article came about. Trying to understand more about what was happening at the time when police unions went from being largely disfavored by elected officials to rapidly gaining collective bargaining rights, which of course we know now that current elected and appointed officials have started to point to, right, to unions and the protections that unions have as a reason why officers with a history of misconduct or at the center of critical incidents of compelling public interest have been allowed to keep their jobs, right, their badges and their guns.
Yeah, and that's incredibly frustrating for anyone who's dealing with looking at any sort of police reform, is kind of running up against these contracts that were negotiated by unions. And I guess maybe you do a great job in the article of kind of outlining the history of these unions and how they kind of develop over time from what we consider as like a normal union, as you were speaking to kind of conditions of employment, to taking on this other role. So maybe you could talk about how just the general history of the police unions developed.
Yeah. happy to. Thank you. So we know that police unions failed to make any substantial headway, right, in efforts to gain, or police associations, whatever we want to call them in their early stage, right, to gain collective bargaining rights from, we'll say, the late 1800s until the 1960s, right? But along that timeline, 1919 deserves a special stop in history because that's the year that the Boston police strike occurs. And historians or other police, scholars know that that's the year when officers in Boston decided to strike against grueling work conditions, right? There was a war happening, and the police there was the people who were employed by the police were not immune from, the high price of everything, from uniforms to food and everything else, right? And they were also being subjected to long hours. And they had attempted to make demands of their bosses to have collective bargaining rights and to renegotiate, or to be able to negotiate for pay and allowances for uniforms and time off. But those requests went ignored. And so the officers organized a strike that resulted in 3 nights of rioting and needed the state guard to come in to restore order to the city. And so Boston officers wanted union rights conferred that had already been conferred to other employees. Notably, the federal employees, many federal employees had generally been granted collective bargaining rights in 1912 with the passage of a congressional act then. But local leaders and including, folks even in DC, right, the nation's capital, came out strongly against the right of police and firefighters to join labor unions and to negotiate with their employers. And so efforts to unionize, this pushback really came about because those efforts to unionize were seen as anti-American challenges to the sovereign authority of government, if you will. And so between 1919 and 1960s, in the 1960s, you see officers organizing with national labor unions in some instances, right, the AFL-CIO. But more broadly, you see them creating what I referred to almost accidentally earlier, these associations, right? They're creating their own informal associations and fraternal organizations, and also joining, right, a national fraternal organization, but not having the authority to bargain with their employers over wages and hours, right? And so that's between 1919 and 1960, right? And then, of course, we all know, at least I hope we do, right? At least those who are following your podcast know full well the history of this country. And so we know that around that same time, our country is faced with demands for an end to racial discrimination across the country, particularly as the Great Migration is bringing Black people from the South to northern cities, looking for better housing, jobs, right, and opportunities for their families. And you see at the same time, almost essentially, a major about face in elected officials' approach to or response to the police officer demands for unions, for the right to collectively bargain. And so we see 14 states grant police officers collective bargaining rights or unionization from 1961 to 1969. And 12 of those states, 12 of the 14 passed those laws between 1965 and 1969. Some pretty stark numbers that made me definitely want to understand more about what was happening in those states that was leading to such an about face.
Yeah, that about face is the subject of my next question, which is, can you make a very strong case that police unionizing was very much boosted and supported because of Black liberation movements? And can you kind of give us an idea of what the connections between the rise of Black liberation and kind of the acceptance and rise of police unions was, or is, what you discovered?
Yeah. I think, so I couldn't help but spend some time in the paper understanding sort of what the demands were of during the Black, or at least explaining to the reader, right, what the demands were, what the needs were, what was happening in the country during the Black freedom struggle, right? And you have a variety of groups or organizations and individuals who become the faces of those organizations, from SNCC, right, to Martin Luther King, and even, to Malcolm X, right, and the Black Panthers, of course, right. You have all of these different groups, pretty much just regardless of what tactics they think are appropriate to address the need, are all calling for the same thing, right? And that is an end to racial discrimination, an end to discrimination in housing, in education, in employment, and certainly in the way in which Black people are summarily attacked, or killed by police or by vigilantes with police standing by, right? And so we know that that's a track of what's happening in the 50s. It comes to a pretty high pitch in the 1960s, right? And as I was saying, you have this confluence of the Great Migration and the response, right, from elected officials to the concerns of white people who have lived in predominantly white areas throughout this time and are now faced with integration in ways that, history of how they responded, right? And so history about what's happening in cities like Rochester, New York City, Philadelphia, and at some level, Minneapolis and York, Pennsylvania, which interestingly enough, isn't a big city. But what's in common in all of those places is a couple of things. The first is that you have community organizations who are saying, we want accountable police departments and we want external oversight of police departments, right? And that was a theme, I think, throughout many cities, not just those cities, of course, but those are the ones that I had space to focus on in what's a law review article and not a larger piece, right? So, and so we know that they are, that there are pushes in those cities for community oversight, if you will, of police in response to discriminatory behavior against Black people in those cities. And so there's that. And then you also have appointed and elected officials who either are police officers and heads of police unions, or were those people at one point and then become mayors, major mayors in those cities, and the dynamic and how that plays out in sort of responding to demands for in responding to demands for accountable policing that includes community oversight, right? And it reaches a fever pitch in some of the places that I highlight in the paper, right? We know in Rochester, there are huge demands for police oversight, lots of legislation passed by the city council there, and then a backlash from business leaders, from police unions or organizations at the time, the Locust Club, right, and strong efforts really to say that the legislation, the city council people don't have the authority to create the legislation because policing sits squarely only with the head of the police department and nobody else, right? And you see that sort of replayed over and over in New York City and in Philadelphia, where there are multiple rounds of litigation around community oversight. And the drivers of the litigation, surprise, surprise, right, are the heads of police unions. And they, in New York City, right, they raise by today's standards, a very strong coffer of political dollars, right, to fight community oversight. And so in the 1960s, right, we're talking about big dollars, and embark upon using ads that stoke fears of racism and concerns, I mean, not fears of racism, that stoke racist fears, right, about the safety of children, pictures of young white girls walking into a subway, right, and the New York Times is running these ads that are paid for by the Police Benevolent Association out of New York City. And so you start to see that, you know, and there's similar stories in Philadelphia, right? Similar stories in Rochester. And you start to see that type of dynamic playing out very openly in not just court, but then also in the media, right, with interviews to the press and statements by union officials or folks who were heads of police department and now elected, right, to lead cities. I'm thinking Frank Rizzo, right, that make it very, very clear that there's a strong dislike, disfavoring, need to exert control, physical, right, control under the authority of, right, the police department to squash demands for an end to racial discrimination or integration and the like.
And yeah, and some of the, I mean, that's great, because that was going to be my next question, was how this litigation kind of took form. And I think that's, yeah, perfect that you got to it. But, I mean, if you want to speak a little bit more about that, that would be great too. So like, yeah. Go ahead.
You mean the litigation as it relates to the community oversight piece?
Yes, yeah, and then I kind of want to get into what comes out of this litigation as far as like cops as protected class, you know, the idea of the Blue Lives Matter legislation that's currently with us, because we're not just talking about the 60s, this is continuing today, right? So maybe if you could kind of talk about how legislation leads to some of these further protections and weakening of civilian boards and things like that.
No, that's such a, I'm so glad you said that out loud, right? Because as much, I mean, I think the thing that is so fascinating to me about some of the research that I've done in this space, and as much as with certain scholars, they're like, why are we talking about history? Why are we talking about the 19th? And I'm like, if anyone's paying attention, right, history is repeating itself in many forms and fashion. And some of it may be because we don't know our history, and others can be just because we don't pay to, like, we don't care to pay attention to the threads that, sorry about that, we don't care to pay attention to the threads that move forward from across time, right, across decades. I guess the one thing, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were getting to, but we can get to all of it. The one thing that, before we get to the community oversight litigation, the one thing that really strikes me about some of what's happening is we know that there are protesters, right, who are pushing back against sort of the status quo, and when individuals, especially I'm thinking New York City, right, when James Powell is killed in New York City, and there are riots and uprisings, let me use the right word, and there are uprisings in New York City as a result of the off-duty officer, right, in that city killing 15-year-old James Powell. Right. You see protesters, you see people coming out, and you see people getting arrested. And there's pushback, and there's great concern about the response to that. At the same time, you see protests and demands around the need for community oversight. And the lack, you had in some cities, like early Philadelphia, before Frank Rizzo and his immediate predecessor become mayors, right? The individual before him is a huge proponent of community oversight. They see it as a form or a fashion of a way of making peace between, right, the communities that are now forced to integrate in ways that perhaps some didn't have the foresight to be prepared for, right? But wanting to make sure that policing was fair for all and that everybody was safe. And so they had passed, like I mentioned in Rochester, right? They had passed legislation there to establish those oversight boards, only then to have this litigation, these lawsuits filed to prevent the boards. And even though now we know community oversight, external oversight, at least those with recommendation power, is common in many jurisdictions, not all, but common in many jurisdictions across the country. What they were asking for then and what was started then was significantly delayed. And as the research bears out, the resources devoted to it were non-existent. Right. And the ability for the organizations to actually make an impact in understanding what was happening to people on the street of Philadelphia or New York, right, became nearly impossible. Same is true in Rochester, right, because so much time was spent in court fighting about sort of who had the statutory authority to do what. Who would be able to make recommendations? We're just talking about recommendations at this point. We're not even saying like to actually met out discipline. We're just saying to be able to say, right, to be able to investigate the conduct of officers on public streets, and then make recommendations about what should happen if their misconduct doesn't align with, right, the rules, the police general orders, or community expectations. And so you see this litigation taking, multiple years over the course of the first half of the 1960s, if you will, right? And then, as I said earlier, you see this boom of statutory authority around police unionization that gives them the ability to negotiate not just their wages, but now they have legal standing, right, to, in many ways, to enter courthouses. So that's one piece of it, right? But then there's this undercurrent that like isn't necessarily apparent in the court filings, but then that you find in newspaper articles, right? And that is just the blatant racism against individuals, Black people in courthouses. There's this infamous encounter between officers at an arraignment for young people, maybe loosely affiliated with the anti-war movement and the Black Panthers, and they're being arraigned for some conduct during protests, and there's an allegation that a police officer was hurt during the protest, and the officers come and some still with uniforms on, and some just changed out of uniforms, but with their badges visible, and attack people in a courthouse in a major city in America, right, during, civilized times. And the racial rhetoric around the physical attack, right, as recounted by the media at the time, the primary sources at the time, really speak to the presence and the prevalence, not even the undercurrent, right, but the prevalence of racism that's existent in police departments at the time. So that's one piece. The other, and I'm sorry, I feel like maybe I'm talking too much, so you tell me.
No, you're doing great.
The other thing I think is really curious about this, I mean, that's the, so some would say, if you look at the news articles from that time and that incident that I was just recounting, right, that the New York Police Patrolmen's Benevolent Association was trying really hard to sort of like strike a balance between a more right-leaning, arm of their department and what they thought was just necessary to ensure protections and the rights of their officers. And there was apparently an arm of the White Tigers, a police association in New York City affiliated with the John Birch organization. And so that thread is happening. And at the same time, you have across the country Black officers who have joined police departments, many of which have started their own associations, right? They don't have collective bargaining rights, but they've started their own associations, really, as some would say, in the hope of guarding against police brutality against Black people in the street, and making sure that in New York City and in other places, right, that there was a police voice in favor of external oversight or community oversight present in the discussion.
Yeah, it's that story in the courthouse just reminded me a lot of the protests after Floyd, and how the Black Lives Matter movement, is criticizing the police for being overly zealous and militaristic. So the police show up overly zealous and militaristic, which, is one of the ironies of all of this, I guess, is that, they tend to, when they're accused of something, they tend to then go do it. Yeah. But so I want to get kind of to where we are today with police as protected class and the Blue Lives Matter in regard to kind of this Black Lives Matter movement I was just talking about, and how some of the litigation, some of the laws that are out there right now that have been passed, and kind of where we stand.
Get
into reasons for hope.
Yeah. So this is a next article, right? In many ways, but I plant seeds for it in this current piece, right? Because what we see is a push for part of the way in which police unions become really popular, right? And their efforts to squash external oversight become accepted by the populace, right? By the majority of the voting electorate in their cities, right? Is to position themselves as like, well, folks are telling you, right, like there's a Black liberation, there's need for, civil rights. What about our civil rights, right? And they start talking about, even in that conversation, the recognized union, the PBA in New York, and the Black officer associations, right, police officer associations. You see this conversation play out in the press, like it's too bad the Black officers put their skin color before their position as a police officer, right? And Black officers saying, well, I'm Black first, right? This is a job. This is a job. It is not my racial identity, but that police unions and police leaders have picked up on sort of made a decision to use organizing efforts similar to what they've seen be successful, right? And there's at the time scholars are writing about this as a tactic that's clearly being adopted and used by union organizing officials to sort of say, stand with blue, right? And this is again in the 60s, right? But now we see it, as you mentioned, right, with the passage of these laws, Blue Lives Matter laws, right? And that really do assert that cops should have protected class status. As if there weren't already laws that had heightened criminal offenses for people who attack officers or do harm to officers anyway. And so in response to, I would say, much of, if we say from like 2012, 2014 moving forward, right, we see now in this current wave of demands for police reform, a similar response to what was being levied by unions back in the 60s. Yeah.
And I think that just kind of proves your thesis that the more Black liberation movement happens, then there's the pushback with the police unions and greater protections and lack of accountability, I guess, is what it comes down to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the difference, I think, at the time in the 60s, right, folks were given access, social scientists and researchers, right, had access to police officers. And there's some famous studies, right, that look at the attitudes of police officers. They go into several municipal departments in major cities and talk to officers about their views, their job, their views on racial issues and the like. And nobody kept their racism a secret. They had no problem saying very clearly how they felt. I mean, the percentage of folks who expressed open racial animus against Black community members and Black officers, I guess maybe refreshing to hear the frank sort of position about their thoughts, and what was motivating them. That's not to say that the percentage would still be the same if we had similar studies done, but I don't think anybody really has access to folks in the same way. And I also don't know that people would. A number of years have passed. Let me say it this way: a number of decades have passed. Right, there are social norms, and there's been a long push, right, for colorblindness and everything else. And so, in many ways, right, the racial rhetoric of the '60s is not the same. Right, the open sort of racial animus that you would hear with epithets and violence and the like, simply because of someone's skin color, right? I think many in our country understand and recognize that that is not, that would be frowned upon, right? And at the same time, we know that there is the FBI acknowledged almost a decade ago, I guess now it's wild, about the need to pay attention to the infiltration of white supremacists in both the military and law enforcement, and so there's something there that we need to be thoughtful about, that we need to be responsive to, stay aware of, and then be responsive to as appropriate. And so that's harder to do now, though, when people understand and recognize what's disfavored and frowned upon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost as we make progress, so does the white supremacy and the hate. So yeah. As you change the language, so do they, and then we become less, and it becomes a whole complicated.
Yeah, and then not to mention the push for everyone just not to know their history, right? I mean, we started this talking about sort of like how history repeats itself, right? But if certain leaders have their way, right, in different states and local governments, right, we won't be able to tell any of this history, right? And the erasure of it in that way only makes it far more likely that we will repeat the same mistakes over and over again, and as somebody who always wants to improve and be better, I don't know, right, that being in that place is ultimately what we want as a nation. Yeah.
Well, that leads me to my last question, which is reasons for hope. Can you give us maybe one, maybe two, if you can?
Oh, John. Reasons for hope. Maybe one thing I'll say is people like you doing this work, right? Making sure that information is available. I've been a huge proponent, fan, consumer of public library resources, and they're so critically important. I started out as a kid, of course, as a fiction girl, but I find myself in the nonfiction space more than anywhere else now. And all of it is critically important, right, to shaping and molding and understanding the world around us. And so I think as long as we have spaces and access to things like this, there's hope, and that might sound like really terrible, but that's where I am. Where access to information is the biggest hope that we might have. But that's maybe one thing. And the second thing maybe that I would say is that the more we talk about and think about and have people of goodwill and intentions, and I don't mean that like, oh, bless your heart, as long as you mean well, everything will be fine, right? I mean people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of recognizing harms, and then being very intentional about crafting solutions to those harms, understanding that everything doesn't have to be perfect, right, as you craft these solutions, but that doing nothing, right, is essentially agreeing to fail. And so I think as long as we have folks who are willing to roll up their sleeves, right, wrestle with the harsh realities, the difficult truths, right, and say, I want to find common ground. How do we do better? How do we do better as, a community, a small community? How do we do better as an institution? How do we do better as a city, right? A major city? How do we do better and take it, one piece and part? I've said a few times, because I live in a community like you, where people want desperately to affect change. And what I found over the years is that people are willing to do the first thing, which is hear about the harms and educate themselves about the harm. But then the next step of using your influence and your power to actually change it, which is also a thread of this article that I conceptualized, but admittedly didn't execute as well in the writing, right? Which was like helping the electorate understand that like we have to be intentional about the choices that we're making, that we don't respond based out of propaganda and fear, right? But that we really think about and we make the people that we elect, right, stay true to the priorities that we have identified.